Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
It was supposed to be the night that belonged to me, the night when, after years of fighting for every inch of progress, I could finally stand in a room full of people and hear someone say they were proud of me. The venue was grand in a way that felt almost ridiculous, with chandeliers bigger than my first apartment and wine that cost more per bottle than my monthly grocery bill had for most of college. Everyone was dressed up like it was the damn Oscars, laughing into crystal glasses and balancing tiny plates of shrimp cocktails and roast beef sliders. And there I was, in the middle of it, wearing a dress I had bought on clearance 3 months ago, sitting at a table filled with people who barely knew me anymore. I had worked myself raw for this degree, 3 jobs at a time, late-night shifts at the diner, tutoring freshman English majors who thought reading SparkNotes was the same thing as writing an essay, and living on ramen and black coffee long enough to forget what a real meal tasted like. There were nights I had fallen asleep at the library with my head on a textbook, nights I had cried alone in my car because the whole world felt too damn heavy. No rich boyfriend to bail me out. No handouts. No family connections greasing the wheels. Just me and the mountain I had to climb. The microphone crackled to life and the room started to settle, all eyes turning toward the small stage where my father, Frank, stood beaming like he had personally invented the concept of graduation. He held a glass of bourbon in one hand and the microphone in the other, his voice loud and confident, the way it always was when he had an audience. I leaned forward slightly, waiting for it, hoping, just for a second, that maybe this time would be different. But no, it never is. He started talking about Kyle and his incredible business empire, about how proud he was of his son for expanding from 1 store to 30 stores. No, wait, maybe it was 15 stores in 30 states. He laughed at the mix-up, but no one else did. They just kept smiling and nodding like they were at a damn political rally. I stared down at my hands, trying not to let the blood rush to my cheeks, feeling that familiar, sinking hollow open up inside me like a manhole into some deep, dark place. Kyle stood 2 tables away, arms crossed over his chest, soaking up the praise like a sponge soaks up dirty water. Kyle, the golden boy, the favorite son, the one who had never once gone without a safety net in his life. Kyle, who had built his empire by borrowing money from friends he never paid back and cutting every ethical corner he could find. Kyle, whose idea of a hard day was having to fire someone over Zoom. I forced a smile onto my face so hard it hurt my jaw, clapping politely along with everyone else as my father rambled on about entrepreneurship, leadership, perseverance, all words that felt like a slap across my face. Words I had lived by for years, but apparently, they only counted if you had the right last name attached to a shiny enough bank account. I should have stayed quiet, right? But sometimes, silence tastes worse than betrayal. The servers started moving through the crowd again, topping off champagne glasses and refilling plates, but I barely noticed them. I kept hearing my father's words echoing inside my skull, each one cutting a little deeper, leaving slices of old hurt that had never fully healed. There were people here who had known me since I was in diapers, people who had seen me at birthday parties and school plays, who had given me graduation cards and hugs. They knew, damn it. They knew what this night was supposed to be about, and yet none of them said a word. No one interrupted. No one stood up and said, "Frank, aren't we here for Rachel?" They just let it happen. Let it roll right over me like I was some forgotten afterthought at a party thrown in my honor. The band started tuning their instruments at the back of the room, getting ready for the dance portion of the night. Couples laughed and rejoined conversations, the moment already passing like it had never even happened. I stared at the half-empty champagne flute in front of me, the bubbles rising and popping, a little private rebellion happening right there in the glass. I looked up at the stage again, at the microphone still standing there lonely on its stand, and a thought flickered through my mind, dangerous and wild and almost funny in its wrongness. Maybe it was time someone else had a turn to speak. Maybe it was time I reminded them whose damn night this was supposed to be. I caught my reflection in the big mirror across the ballroom, a girl in a wrinkled dress with too much sadness in her eyes. No, not a girl. A woman. A woman who had earned her place, who had bled and sweated and clawed her way up from nothing. And I was not about to let them pretend I didn't exist. My chair scraped against the polished floor as I pushed it back. A few heads turned. My heart thudded against my ribs so hard it hurt. I wiped my sweaty palms on the skirt of my dress, grabbed my glass of champagne for courage, and started walking toward the stage, every step feeling heavier than the last. They say there's a moment when you cross a line you can never uncross, a point of no return so small you barely notice it until it's way too late. I crossed it halfway to the microphone, and by the time I got there was no going back. The worst part about betrayal is not the act itself, but the slow, grinding moment when you realize that everyone around you is pretending not to notice. My heels clicked against the glossy ballroom floor as I made my way back to my table, feeling the weight of every indifferent glance, every polite smile that only thinly veiled their discomfort. I sat back down, the chair cold against my legs through the cheap fabric of my dress, and tried to drown out the sound of my father's voice filling the room again. He was back at the microphone, emboldened by the clapping, the laughter, the polite nods from old golf buddies and family friends who had probably been to more graduation parties than they could count. His voice boomed, fueled by 2 bourbons and a lifetime of believing that only winners deserve the spotlight. Now, I might be just a little biased, he said, winking at the crowd like some washed-up late-night comedian, but I think Kyle is doing pretty damn well for himself. 30 stores across 15 states, he paused, confused for a second, chuckling into the microphone. Wait, no, that's 15 stores across 30 states. Well, whatever it is, it's pretty damn impressive. The mistake hung there awkwardly, like a fart in church, but nobody dared to correct him. A few scattered laughs broke the tension, but most people just clapped louder, as if noise alone could erase the stupidity of it. I felt a laugh bubble up inside me, sharp and bitter like cheap whiskey, and for a second I thought I might actually start cackling right there in my chair. I covered it with a sip of champagne, letting the fizz burn down my throat, pretending that this was just another joke I was in on. I scanned the faces in the room, letting my gaze land on people who had known Kyle and me since we were kids. There was Mrs. Reynolds from down the street, who used to bake cookies for us after soccer games, Mr. Hammond, the old coach who had taught us both how to throw a football before Kyle decided he was too important for team sports. Their smiles looked tight, brittle around the edges, like they were forcing themselves to be proud. It hit me, then, harder than I wanted to admit. They knew. Maybe not the details, maybe not the full rot under the shiny surface, but they knew something was off. 3 months ago, I had stumbled onto the truth the way you trip over something you did not even realize was in your path. I had been home for spring break, rummaging through the old filing cabinet in the basement for my birth certificate, stupid paperwork for a passport application. Among the mess of old tax returns and water-damaged report cards, I found a thin folder labeled Kyle, Business. I should have closed it. I should have minded my own damn business. But curiosity is a nasty little itch, and before I knew it, I was flipping through invoices, contracts, overdue notices from vendors, and ugly letters from law firms. Kyle's empire, it turned out, was built less on hard work and more on unpaid bills, shady handshakes, and exploiting people who did not know better. He had racked up debt under shell companies, shifted liability around like a street magician with 3 cups and a ball, and bullied small business owners into selling for pennies just so he could flip their shops into chain stores with shiny logos and bland promises. The Golden Boy was nothing but a glorified con artist, and here he was being celebrated like the second coming of Steve Jobs. My hands tightened around the stem of the champagne glass, the cold pressing into my skin as my father droned on about good old-fashioned American grit and bootstrapping success, like it was a sermon he had practiced in the mirror. I could feel something hot and dangerous building inside my chest, a slow, rising pressure that no amount of deep breathing or polite smiling was going to keep bottled up. It would be so easy to let it go. To sit there, smile, play the good daughter for another night, and let Kyle ride the wave of undeserved praise while I swallowed down my pride like a jagged little pill. After all, what did it matter? I had my degree. I had done the work. I knew the truth even if nobody else wanted to hear it. Was that not enough? But it was not enough. Not tonight. Not after everything I had gone through to get here. Not after being erased from my own damn celebration by a man who could not see beyond his own shallow idea of success. Not after Kyle had stolen so much from so many and still strutted around like he owned the world. The room blurred slightly as I blinked against the hot sting in my eyes. I was not going to cry. I refused to give them that satisfaction. Instead, I straightened my back, set down my glass with a sharp clink against the table, and pushed my chair back with a screech that cut through the polite background noise like a knife. A few heads turned, curious. I could feel their eyes following me as I stood up slowly, smoothing down the skirt of my dress with hands that trembled only slightly. I looked up at the stage, at the microphone that still stood there unattended, like a challenge nobody else had the guts to accept. My father was laughing again, oblivious, waving his glass around as he told some half-true story about Kyle negotiating a major contract that had put their family on the map. Behind him, Kyle leaned casually against the wall, grinning like he already knew he had one. I took a step forward. Then another. The clapping faded, replaced by a thick, expectant silence that seemed to press against my ears. Every part of me screamed to sit down, to stay quiet, to not make a scene. Good girls did not make scenes. Good daughters smiled and nodded and let themselves be overlooked. But I was so tired of being a good daughter. With one last breath, I walked straight toward the stage, my heart pounding so loudly that it drowned out every other sound in the room. There was a line, invisible but undeniable, between what I had been and what I was about to become. And as I moved closer to the microphone, I knew deep down, with a certainty that scared me, that once I crossed it, there would be no going back. The microphone was heavier than I expected, cold and slick under my fingers like it knew the weight of the moment better than I did. My heart thudded so hard against my ribs that for a split second I was sure the sound of it would leak into the speakers, exposing how scared I was, how close I stood to backing down and returning to the safe, silent girl everyone knew. I wrapped both hands around the mic, squeezing tight enough that my knuckles turned pale, and lifted my chin to face the crowd. Across the room, my father's smile faltered for half a heartbeat before stretching wider, like an old balloon losing its shape but determined to hold on. He lifted his glass toward me in a toast, nodding encouragement as if he truly believed I was about to gush about Kyle or maybe share a sweet little story from our childhood to tie a bow on his speech. My brother stayed slouched against the wall, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, so sure of his place at the center of our family's pride that he barely looked at me. The room was too quiet, the kind of silence that prickles against your skin and makes you want to fidget, but I stood perfectly still. I let them stew in the discomfort, let them wonder just what the hell I was doing up there in my clearance dress and scuffed heels. I gave myself a beat longer, let the tension stretch until I could almost hear it humming in the air between us. I brought the microphone to my mouth, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. You know, I said, my words slow and deliberate. Real success doesn't always look the way you think it does. I could feel the ripple move through the crowd like the first tremor before an earthquake, people exchanging looks, sitting a little straighter, sensing something was off, but not sure yet if it was safe to react. I smiled, a tight, sharp thing that did not reach my eyes, and continued. Real success, I said, looks like sleepless nights spent wondering how you're going to pay the rent while still showing up the next morning with your head held high. It looks like taking every damn job you can find just to keep your dream alive, even when nobody's watching, even when nobody gives a damn. I saw my father's smile tighten into something more brittle, and behind him, my mother shifted uncomfortably in her seat, adjusting the strap of her evening gown like it was suddenly choking her. I kept going because stopping now would have been worse than never starting at all. Real success isn't about how many stores you own, I said, letting my voice sharpen just enough to slice through the growing whispers. It's about how you build them. It's about whether you can look yourself in the mirror at the end of the day and not flinch. There was a flicker of movement in the back of the room as one of Kyle's old business partners, a guy named Rick, who used to work construction with him before Kyle got too big to return phone calls, crossed his arms and stared down at the floor. I caught his eye briefly, saw something there, maybe guilt, maybe gratitude, and it was enough to push me forward. I think it's easy, I said, each word dropping like a stone into the silence, to slap a logo on a building, to hire cheap labor, to push little family businesses out of the way and call it progress. It's easy to celebrate that from a distance, to pretend it's the American dream when you're not the one being crushed by it. My father's face had frozen into something ugly and unrecognizable, and for the first time in my life, I felt taller than him. I felt bigger than the narrow world he had tried to shove me into for so many years. I took a breath, tasting the fear in the room like smoke before a fire, and leaned a little closer to the mic. But sometimes, I said, my voice dropping to almost a whisper, forcing them all to lean in whether they wanted to or not, sometimes the empire you're so proud of has blood on its hands. The room went still, the kind of stillness that feels almost physical, like the air itself is holding its breath. I let the words hang there, let them sink into every crack and corner of the ballroom, into every polite conversation and congratulatory hug they had planned for the rest of the night. I felt the shift, the slow turning of heads toward Kyle, the way people began to connect the dots they had been trying so hard not to see. I turned then, very deliberately, and looked straight at Kyle. The moment our eyes met, the bottom dropped out of the room. He stopped smirking. His arms fell from their lazy fold across his chest, and for the first time all night, he looked small, not like the untouchable success story they had all painted him to be, but like the scared little boy he had always been deep down, hiding behind shiny suits and bigger lies. Dead silence. Nothing but the sound of my own heart, calm now, steady in my chest, as I stood there and waited for the empire of bullshit to come crashing down around us. The microphone trembled slightly in my hand, not from fear anymore, but from the overwhelming rush of adrenaline that comes when you realize there is no damn way to turn back now, no escape hatch waiting for you if things get ugly. I stood there under the crushing brightness of the ballroom lights, the sea of familiar and unfamiliar faces stretching out before me like a courtroom jury, their verdicts waiting somewhere beyond the next few words I would say. I did not look at my father, and I did not look at Kyle. Instead, I looked right into the heart of the crowd because I wanted them all to see me, to hear me, to understand that some truths burn too fiercely to stay hidden forever. I shifted the microphone closer to my lips, feeling the heat rising in the room, the kind of heat that does not come from temperature, but from discomfort, shame, and the first breathless seconds after a lie is ripped into the open air. My voice stayed even, each syllable dropping heavy as a hammer against the polished walls and delicate crystal chandeliers. You see, I began, drawing the moment out just long enough to let the tension coil tighter. Not every story you are told about success has clean hands behind it. There was a ripple then, subtle but real, like someone had dropped a pebble into the surface of a still lake and a few heads turned sharply toward Kyle without even realizing they were doing it. I smiled inwardly, a smile that tasted of old pain and new power, and kept going, refusing to let the silence heal over the wound I had just ripped open. I could stand here and congratulate certain people, I said, careful not to say his name just yet because names give people a chance to dismiss you, to say you are just being petty or jealous or cruel. I could stand here and pretend that making money, at any cost, is the same thing as achievement. That profit justifies the means, no matter who gets steamrolled along the way. In the front row, I saw Emily, Kyle's perfect, polished fiancée, stiffen like a statue, her manicured fingers tightening around the stem of her champagne glass until I thought it might snap in her hand. Her smile had frozen in place, too wide, too desperate, the way someone smiles when they are trying not to vomit at a funeral. But the thing is, I continued, taking another small step forward, letting my voice drop a little lower, almost conversational now. When you build your so-called empire on shady loans, on evictions, on broken promises to families who trusted you, well, eventually, the truth has a way of crawling out into the light. The murmuring started then, low and confused at first, like bees stirring in a disturbed hive. A few people looked genuinely stunned, but others, the ones who had done business with Kyle, who had heard whispers in boardrooms and after-hours bars, looked more resigned than surprised, their eyes darting nervously between Kyle and me as if trying to figure out which side to pretend they had been on all along. I could see my father now out of the corner of my eye, his mouth twitching like he was desperate to interrupt, to shout me down, but he held back, trapped by the politeness of the setting, by the dozens of witnesses who would see if he tried to drag me off stage like a rebellious child. Instead, he made a tiny, frantic gesture with his hand, trying to wave me down, trying to save face before it all went completely to hell. I ignored him. I leaned into the microphone just a little more, savoring the taste of the moment of finally being heard. Sometimes, I said, my voice ringing out strong and merciless across the ballroom, the golden boy has blood on his hands, and you just painted it gold. There was a beat of silence so profound it felt like the whole building stopped breathing, and in that beat, everything that had been carefully constructed around Kyle, the reputation, the admiration, the smug certainty, started to crack. I could hear someone near the back mutter something sharp under their breath, could see Emily press her hand to her mouth, as if she might be sick right there on the rented carpet. My father could not hold it in any longer. He surged forward, stepping up to the stage with a look on his face I had never seen before, a twisted mix of fury, fear, and something almost pleading. "Rachel," he hissed under his breath, loud enough for the people in the front rows to hear enough. "You're embarrassing yourself." I turned and looked him dead in the eye, the way a soldier looks at the enemy before pulling the trigger, and for the first time in my entire life, I saw him for what he really was, not a protector, not a proud patriarch, but a scared old man desperate to preserve the pretty little lies that made him feel important. "I think we've all been embarrassed enough," I said softly, my words slicing sharper than any scream ever could. For a second, just a second, I thought he might physically grab me, might pull the microphone out of my hand and drag me down from the stage in front of everyone, but pride is a funny thing. Pride and fear of scandal pinned him there, kept him rooted to the floor while I stood tall above him. And that was when Kyle moved. I saw him before I heard him, the sudden lurch forward, the stomp of his dress shoes against the polished floor, the snarl twisting his mouth into something almost unrecognizable. He was coming toward the stage fast, one hand outstretched like he was about to rip the microphone out of my hands himself, like if he just moved quickly enough he could undo everything, stuff the truth back into whatever dark corner he thought he had hidden it in. But it was too late. It had already begun. Kyle's footsteps pounded against the ballroom floor so hard that for a moment I thought he might crack the polished surface beneath him, but still I stood there, silent and unmoving. The microphone now hanging loosely from my hand like a sword lowered, after a battle already won. His face twisted with a kind of rage I had never seen before, not the smug irritation he usually showed when someone dared question him, but something hotter, more desperate, something that smelled like fear more than anger. He stopped just short of the stage, glaring up at me like I had personally set fire to everything he had ever touched. "You're just jealous," he spat, his voice carrying across the room as guests froze mid-sip, mid-bite, mid-smile, caught between politeness and the unfolding train wreck they could not seem to tear their eyes away from. "You're nothing, Rachel. You've always been nothing. That's why Dad never talked about you." That's why nobody cares about your little piece of paper. I watched him, my heart strangely steady, as the venom poured out of him, words sharpened not by truth, but by sheer panic, the unraveling of a carefully built lie that he could no longer contain. I could have answered him. I could have grabbed the microphone, thrown all his sins into the crowd like confetti at a parade, but I knew it was not necessary. His desperation was louder than anything I could say now, more damning than any evidence I could ever produce. So I did something much more powerful than shouting back. I let the microphone slip from my fingers, letting it fall with a hollow clatter onto the stage floor that echoed through the stunned silence of the room, and I turned my back on him without saying a single word. I walked past him slowly, deliberately, feeling the searing heat of his gaze boring into my spine, but I never looked back. Some wars are won not by fighting, but by refusing to kneel, by refusing to acknowledge the power someone thinks they have over you. Behind me, chaos was blooming like a poisonous flower. I heard my aunt's voice first, shrill and shaking as she demanded answers from my father, her questions slicing through the brittle silence like a blade. "Is it true, Frank? Did you know? Did you help him?" Then another voice, my mother's this time, low and broken, whispering Kyle's name like a prayer or a curse. I could not tell which. Chairs scraped backward, shoes squeaked against the floor, plates clattered to the ground. Arguments burst out like wildfire, some furious, some pleading, others filled with the kind of disbelief that only comes when you realize the people you admired have been building their lives on lies. Guests were leaving in droves, clutching their coats, their purses, their dignity, escaping into the cold night air rather than staying to watch the collapse of what had once looked like such a perfect family. I slipped out through a side door, the heavy wood creaking quietly as it swung closed behind me, and the frigid air of the early summer night hit me like a slap, shocking and clean after the suffocating heat of the ballroom. I crossed the empty patio slowly, heels clicking against the flagstones, and finally sank down onto a stone bench at the edge of the garden, my breath steaming slightly in the air as if my body was still burning off the last scraps of anger. I was free now, I realized, free in a way I had never been before, no longer shackled to their expectations, their disappointments, their selective blindness to everything that did not fit into the pretty picture they had wanted to paint. But freedom, it turned out, had a weight all its own, heavy and cold, and not nearly as comforting as I had imagined it would be during all those sleepless nights when I dreamed of telling the truth. I pulled my phone out of my clutch almost without thinking, the screen lighting up my hands with a blue glow that made my skin look ghostly. No missed calls from my father. No messages from my mother begging me to come back inside and apologize. Just a single new text blinking at me, a tiny line of black letters on a white screen. It was from Emily. "Thank you," it said. Two simple words, clean and quiet, carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths between them. I stared at the message for a long time, the night pressing in around me, the stars cold and sharp against the dark velvet of the sky. I wondered what Emily was thanking me for saving her from marrying a man who would have sold her out the first time it suited him, or maybe for giving her the excuse she needed to finally open her eyes and see the life she almost trapped herself inside. Or maybe she was thanking me for something bigger, something I could not even name yet, something to do with the way lies corrode everything they touch until there is nothing left but hollow victories and empty champagne glasses. I tucked the phone back into my bag, pushed myself up from the bench, and started walking down the winding garden path that led away from the venue, away from the wreckage I had left behind. My heels sank slightly into the soft earth, but I kept moving, each step lighter than the one before, even though the loneliness pressed against my ribs like a second heartbeat. Maybe I would wake up tomorrow and regret it. Maybe I would wake up a week from now, or a year, and wish I had kept my mouth shut, swallowed my pride, and played the part they had written for me. Maybe I would miss the safety of pretending, even if that safety was nothing more than a pretty lie. But for now, as the cool night wrapped itself around me and the last flickers of the party died behind me like dying stars, I let myself feel the strange, bittersweet relief of having burned it all down. Not every ending is neat. Not every fire leaves behind something beautiful. Sometimes all you are left with is ashes at midnight and the faint, stubborn hope that maybe, somehow, you can build something better from the wreckage.